February 2025. NBC executives are sitting in a Manhattan boardroom, and they're looking at two columns of numbers. On the left side, veteran WNBA players, champions, Olympic gold medalists, women who flew commercial, played in half-empty arenas, and kept a struggling league on life support for 2 decades. On the right side, one 23-year-old rookie who had played exactly 1 professional season. The executives didn't need to debate. They didn't need to consult historians or honor legacy. The numbers made the decision for them before anyone even opened their mouth. And in that moment, careers that had survived injuries, low salaries, empty stadiums, and years of being ignored by mainstream sports media ended. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a press conference, with a spreadsheet. But here's what makes this story different from every other tale of a rising star replacing the old guard. The veterans saw it coming. They felt it building for months. And instead of stepping aside gracefully or finding a way to rise with the tide, they fought it, tooth and nail, elbow and shoulder, podcast and social media post. They spent nearly 2 years trying to make one player feel unwelcome in a league that desperately needed her. And now those same players are watching that rookie sit courtside at NBA games, breaking down LeBron James and Steph Curry on national television, building a brand so powerful that their entire league restructured itself around her name. The revenge didn't come from Caitlin Clark. She never threw a punch back. The revenge came from the people who write the checks, and those people just decided the old guard became dead weight the moment they declared war on their own golden goose. This isn't just a basketball story. This is one of the most brutal karma arcs professional sports has ever seen, and we're going to connect every dot because the mainstream media keeps dancing around the edges of this thing without ever saying what's actually happening. Let's go back to where this all started, because you can't understand the fall without understanding how bad things were before she arrived. The Indiana Fever, the team that drafted Caitlin Clark in April 2024, had become a symbol of everything wrong with the WNBA's market position. Their average home attendance was hovering around 4,000 fans in a 17,000-seat arena. Think about what that looks like in person. Rows and rows of empty seats, a crowd so small you could hear individual conversations from across the gym. Tickets were practically being given away because the demand simply wasn't there. Road teams weren't requesting bigger venues, broadcasters weren't fighting over rights, corporate sponsors weren't lining up with big checks. The Fever weren't just bad, they were invisible. And the Fever weren't alone. The WNBA as a whole was fighting a quiet battle for relevance that wasn't going well. On a good night, a WNBA game might draw 400,000 television viewers. On a slow weekday afternoon, some games were pulling fewer than 100,000. To put that in perspective, a mid-tier college football game on a regional channel pulls more eyeballs than that. Players were flying commercial because the league couldn't afford charter flights. Teams were operating on shoestring budgets. The players who had dedicated their careers to the league, who had turned down higher-paying opportunities overseas to build something at home, were doing it in conditions that barely reflected professional athletics. Networks treated WNBA broadcast rights like a charitable obligation rather than a business opportunity. You took the deal because it was the right thing to do, not because the numbers made sense. Sponsorship dollars were modest, merchandise sales were flat, the league existed, it competed, it produced genuine world-class athletes, and almost nobody outside of hardcore fans was paying attention. This was the landscape when Caitlin Clark walked in, and what happened next wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow build. It flipped overnight like someone threw a switch. The moment she was drafted, something shifted in the atmosphere around women's basketball that nobody had ever quite felt before. Season ticket sales for the Indiana Fever jumped 300% in a single week. Not a month, 1 week. Road teams started calling arena managers and asking to move Fever away games to larger venues because their normal facilities couldn't accommodate the sudden demand. Her first professional game drew 2.4 million television viewers, nearly 6 times what the league had been averaging on a good night. The money followed the eyeballs like it always does. Ticket prices surged, merchandise sales broke every record the league had on file, corporate sponsors who had been lukewarm on women's basketball started making calls. TV networks that had treated WNBA rights like a burden were suddenly interested in being in business.
The Fever went from a punchline to the hottest ticket in the league inside of weeks, and the effect wasn't contained to Indiana, it rippled across every franchise. When Caitlin Clark's team came to your city, you moved the game somewhere bigger, you raised your prices, you sold out. The rising tide didn't just lift the Fever's boat, it lifted the entire fleet.
Before she arrived, an Indiana home game might generate around $50,000 in ticket revenue. After she arrived, that number jumped past $300,000. Before she arrived, WNBA merchandise sales had been stagnant for years. After her first season, league-wide sales jumped by double digits. Peacock, NBC's streaming platform, tracked a 35% increase in subscriptions during the WNBA season and traced the bump almost directly to the availability of her games on the platform. These aren't estimates or projections, these are real numbers from real businesses making real decisions based on real data. You'd think the players who had spent years fighting for the league's survival would have looked at those numbers and said thank you. You'd be wrong. Diana Taurasi, one of the greatest players in the history of the sport, a 5-time WNBA champion, an Olympic gold medalist, went on a podcast before the season even began and started talking about how Clark would struggle against professional defenders, how the college game is different, how fame doesn't automatically translate to success at the next level. On the surface, it sounded like honest analysis from an experienced veteran. Underneath, it felt like something else, a warning shot, a reminder of who owned this territory and who was just visiting. Other veterans followed. They started doing interviews where they conspicuously avoided saying Caitlin's name, like acknowledging her out loud would somehow give her more power. They talked about the league's history, the players who built the foundation, the standards that needed to be upheld, all of it coded language for "this is our house and she needs to understand that." The tone was set before the first tip-off, and once the game started, the hostility stopped being verbal. Kennedy Carter's shoulder check became a national news story almost immediately. The contact was so deliberate, so obvious, that casual fans who had never watched a WNBA game in their lives saw the clip and understood exactly what they were looking at. This wasn't a hard foul in the flow of competition. This was a message. And the response from the sideline made sure everyone got it. Angel Reese, sitting on the bench, clapped. She celebrated it like Carter had just hit a game winner. The message traveled beyond basketball arenas and into living rooms and comment sections and sports talk radio, and not in the way the veterans intended. The cheap shots didn't stop there. Flagrant fouls that referees let slide, hard screens thrown at Clark away from the ball, in spots where the camera angles made it easy to miss. Trash talk that crossed the line from competitive banter into something more personal and more pointed. Social media posts throwing shade at the attention she was getting. Podcast appearances where veterans complained that the media was being biased, that Caitlin was being promoted over players who had actually paid their dues. Some even framed the coverage as unfair to players of color, a serious allegation that deserved a serious conversation, but one that got tangled up in what was clearly also professional jealousy and resentment. The fans noticed all of it. They started asking a question out loud that the veterans really didn't want asked. Why are these players mad that someone is finally bringing their league attention? It was a question that didn't have a comfortable answer. Here's the part that gets overlooked in most coverage of this story, because it requires giving the veterans some genuine credit before laying out exactly how badly they miscalculated. The resentment wasn't entirely irrational. These women had done something genuinely hard. They had built a professional league in a sports landscape that didn't want to make room for them. They had played through seasons where the arenas were embarrassingly empty, where the paychecks reflected the league's struggle rather than their talent, where they had to promote themselves constantly just to keep the product visible. They had gone overseas in the off-season to play in European leagues because the WNBA alone couldn't sustain them financially. They had done all of that without anywhere near the attention that a 23-year-old with a college highlight reel was getting before she played a single professional minute. The anger wasn't really about Caitlin Clark the person. It was about a feeling that the league they had sacrificed for was suddenly crediting someone else for its success.
that all those years of grinding were being written off because a more marketable face had arrived. That felt like a betrayal, and some version of that feeling was understandable. But here's where the math got brutal and the feelings became irrelevant to what was about to happen. The question of who deserved credit for the league's growth was a human question, a moral question, and businesses don't answer moral questions, they answer financial ones. And the answer to the financial question was simple: who is bringing value right now, today, in this quarter? The answer to that question wasn't complicated, and the answer was not the veterans. And by choosing to fight Clark rather than align with her, the veterans made sure that when the business world started making decisions, they'd already been categorized as part of the problem.
They handed the executives a narrative. They made it easy. You don't have to feel bad about leaving people behind when those people spent 2 years making themselves into obstacles. February 2025. NBC announces a massive media rights deal covering both the NBA and the WNBA. The numbers involved were staggering, billions of dollars across the full agreement, with the WNBA portion representing the largest broadcast contract in the league's history. After a deal that size, everyone expected the network to start building promotional campaigns around the league's royalty, the champions, the legends, the players who had been the public face of women's basketball for the better part of 2 decades. Instead, NBC made a decision that sent shockwaves through the basketball world. They put Caitlin Clark on NBA broadcasts, not WNBA coverage, NBA coverage, the biggest stage in American basketball. She's on screen with Vince Carter and Carmelo Anthony during pregame shows. She's analyzing LeBron James's footwork and breaking down Steph Curry's off-ball movement for a national audience. She's being treated not as a women's basketball player doing a favor for a sister league, but as a credible basketball voice on the most prominent platform the sport has. Meanwhile, Diana Taurasi, arguably the greatest player in WNBA history, is not in NBC's promotional material for the league she helped define. Breanna Stewart, a 2-time WNBA champion and a player who has never stopped being excellent, is invisible in Peacock's marketing campaigns. The women who built the foundation that NBC just paid billions to stand on are not in the commercials. Caitlin Clark is. Think about how calculated that decision really was. NBC didn't have to do it this way. They could have built a whole narrative around the league's rich history. They could have honored the veterans, featured the champions, created content around the decades of sacrifice that made the WNBA worth billions in broadcast rights. They had every opportunity to be diplomatic. Instead, they ran their promotional materials through audience testing with casual sports fans, people who don't follow the WNBA closely, and the results were decisive. When the test groups saw posters featuring Taurasi or Stewart, engagement was minimal. When they saw Clark, the reaction was measurably different. People recognized her. They were curious about her. They wanted to see what she would do next. NBC made the choice that the data told them to make. It just happened to land on the veterans like a verdict. A Caitlin Clark game on Peacock was pulling over 1 million viewers. A comparable WNBA game without her in it was pulling around 300,000. That's a 70% drop in viewership between one player's presence and her absence. For a streaming platform that lives and dies by subscription numbers and engagement data, that difference isn't a minor footnote, it's the entire business case. NBC didn't build their WNBA strategy around Clark because they were trying to make a statement about the veterans. They built their strategy around her because she was the strategy. The veterans had become, in the cold language of media economics, background noise. The corporate sponsorship picture told the same story. Nike, which sponsors several WNBA veterans and also holds a massive endorsement deal with Clark, had the budget and the profile to run a commercial during Super Bowl 60. The question of who to feature should have been an easy win for a brand that covers the entire sport. Instead, Nike pulled out entirely. They confirmed they wouldn't run a Super Bowl ad at all. No Clark feature, no veteran showcase, nothing. Once you understood the dynamics behind the scenes, the decision made complete sense. NBC didn't want to be in the middle of an active war. If they featured Clark prominently, the veterans and their supporters would turn social media into a battlefield against the brand.
If they featured the veterans, they'd be investing Super Bowl money, some of the most expensive advertising real estate in the world, in players whose public engagement numbers didn't justify the spend. So they sat out completely. The conflict the veterans created had made it impossible for the league's biggest apparel partner to do business cleanly. Other brands didn't have the same hesitation. State Farm, Gatorade, and Wilson all doubled down on Clark without blinking. Her signature shoe line with Nike was moving toward a launch with pre-order numbers that were turning heads. The corporate world was making the same calculation NBC had made just from the sponsorship side. Clark's Instagram posts generated millions of interactions. Veterans' posts generated thousands. When you're a brand deciding where to put your budget, that gap isn't a conversation, it's an answer. Meanwhile, the endorsement landscape for veteran players was quietly getting thinner. Deals that were once reliable were coming up for renewal and not being renewed at the same terms. Companies that had been loyal partners for years were reevaluating their WNBA spending through a new lens, one that asked which players actually moved the needle with consumers who weren't already committed fans. The veterans wanted respect, the corporate world responded with spreadsheets. Here's where the story takes a turn that nobody in the veterans camp saw coming, even though they probably should have.
The WNBA Players Association started making noise about a potential strike. The demands were legitimate on paper. Better pay, improved working conditions, charter flights for every team so players weren't grinding through commercial travel during an already demanding season. These were reasonable asks from professional athletes who had been underpaid relative to the value they provided. Under normal circumstances, a strike threat is a powerful negotiating tool. Players withhold their labor, owners feel the financial pressure, and a deal gets done. Except, this situation wasn't normal circumstances. The owners had leverage they'd never had before, and the source of that leverage was the same person the veterans had spent 2 years trying to undermine. In most labor disputes, the players have the ultimate power, because without them, there is no product to sell. The WNBA's product, at least in the eyes of the networks and the sponsors and the casual fans who had just started paying attention, wasn't the collective league anymore. It was one person, and that one person wasn't part of the union fight. Caitlin Clark was sitting courtside at Lakers games. She was on NBC's NBA programming, getting paid by a network deal that existed whether or not a WNBA season happened. She was building her brand, cultivating her audience, and generating revenue outside the league structure. She didn't need the WNBA season the way the veterans did. If the league went dark for a labor dispute, she had a soft landing. She had television, she had endorsements, she had a platform. The veterans didn't have any of that insulation. No WNBA season meant no games. No games meant no exposure. No exposure meant the endorsement conversations got even harder. The leverage the Players Association thought they had evaporated the moment you mapped out who needed whom. Reports started surfacing that some players were privately urging union leadership to back off the strike threat. They were beginning to see the math, that they were negotiating from a position of weakness at exactly the moment they needed strength, and that the weakness had been created by their own choices during Clark's rookie season. If the owners had to choose between paying veteran players more money or rebuilding the league around younger, cheaper talent who better fit the network's vision, there was a real possibility they'd choose the rebuild. The veterans had handed the owners that option, and now they were trapped in a negotiation with an exit door they'd built for their own opponents. Behind closed doors, team owners were reportedly having conversations that would have seemed far-fetched 18 months earlier. What if they just started over? What if the league leaned fully into youth, into marketability, into the version of the WNBA that NBC was actually promoting, and let the veterans walk away? What if the most efficient path forward wasn't negotiating with the old guard at all? The economics made it a serious conversation rather than a fringe idea. A 10-year veteran earning $200,000 a season, which is already modest by professional sports standards, might generate $50,000 in direct ticket revenue and merchandise for her team. Caitlin Clark generates millions. The math on roster construction starts to look different when you run those numbers.
You don't build a business around sentiment when the sentiment and the data are pointing in opposite directions. NBC had already made its answer clear by putting Clark on NBA broadcasts. The network didn't need to issue a statement or hold a press conference. The decision itself was the communication. We know where value lives. We know who our audience comes to see. We know what our platform looks like with and without her, and we've chosen accordingly. The veterans who tried to make Clark's life miserable in her rookie season were watching that message arrive in real time and understanding, probably for the first time, the full weight of what they had done. If the WNBA season disappeared tomorrow, Caitlin Clark would be fine. She'd still be on television, she'd still be getting paid, she'd still be relevant to the sports conversation in a way that doesn't require a WNBA schedule to exist. The veterans don't have that safety net. Their relevance is tied to the league's relevance is tied to her, and she isn't tied to anything that requires their cooperation. Some players have reportedly begun quiet, private conversations about whether the approach to Clark was a mistake. Not publicly, pride has its own gravity and it doesn't release easily, but in smaller circles where honesty is safer. They're looking at the landscape and asking whether a different reception might have produced a different outcome. Whether welcoming her, amplifying her, becoming part of her story rather than obstacles in it, might have lifted them rather than buried them. Whether the elbow that Kennedy Carter threw and the clap that Angel Reese gave were moments of victory or the first steps towards their own exits.
It might be too late for that reckoning to change anything practical. The business decisions have been made. The contracts are signed. The promotional campaigns have been built. The narrative is set. But the question itself, the quiet, uncomfortable question of what might have been, is going to follow those players for a long time. What's unfolding in the WNBA right now is going to change professional sports in ways that extend well beyond women's basketball. For arguably the first time in the history of a major American league, we're watching an organization completely restructure its identity, its business model, and its relationship with its own talent base around a single athlete. The NBA has superstars. It's always had superstars. But the league doesn't collapse without any one of them. LeBron James is enormous. The league survives without him. The WNBA, as it currently exists, at least in terms of its media value and its sponsorship appeal and its network relationships, is not built to survive without Caitlin Clark. Everything orbits her. The schedule gets built around her games. The marketing focuses on her face. The television contracts prioritize her availability. The entire league has become, intentionally or not, her supporting cast. That's an unstable situation for any organization to be in, and there are people inside the league who understand the danger of it. Rumors have circulated that WNBA commissioners are privately wrestling with what happens if Clark decides to leave the league entirely. What if the endorsement money and the television deals become so large that the WNBA becomes a footnote in her career rather than the main event? What if she finds a way to build her brand that doesn't require playing 40 games a season in a league that treated her poorly? The dependency that the league has created, largely because the veterans forced everyone's hand by making Clark's presence a conflict rather than a celebration, could become the thing that destroys the league's leverage entirely. Young players watching all of this from the sidelines, preparing for their own professional careers, are absorbing a lesson that nobody had to explicitly teach them. Talent matters. It's always mattered. But marketability might matter more. You can't just be excellent at the sport anymore. You have to be excellent at the sport and good for business. You have to understand that the people writing the checks are always doing the math on whether you help or hurt the bottom line. You have to understand that legacy is respected at award ceremonies and largely ignored in boardrooms. The players who got it right in the Clark era weren't the ones who had the most rings. They were the ones who understood which direction the money was flowing and positioned themselves accordingly.
1 year before her first professional game, Caitlin Clark was a college player with a historically deadly three-point shot and a fan base that hadn't yet translated into professional leverage. Today, she's the reason veterans are losing visibility, losing endorsement deals, and watching their long-term leverage in labor negotiations evaporate. She didn't do any of that to them. She didn't orchestrate it. She didn't plan a revenge tour or call in favors. She showed up, played basketball, drew audiences, and let the business world do what the business world always does: follow the money. NBC didn't make this decision out of cruelty toward the veterans. They made it because the numbers forced their hand. When one player brings more demonstrated value than an entire generation of veterans combined, and when those veterans have spent 2 years making themselves part of the story in the worst possible way, the choice stops being a choice. It becomes arithmetic. The veterans had a window. There was a moment right around draft night in April 2024 when the entire arc of this story could have gone differently. They could have welcomed Clark. They could have mentored her publicly, aligned their grands with hers, let the rising tide lift every boat in the harbor. They had the reputation, the history, and the goodwill to have made themselves indispensable to the new era rather than resistant to it. Instead, they chose to fight. They chose elbows and podcasts and social media shade and deliberate physical intimidation. They chose to make her uncomfortable in her own league, and in doing so, they handed everyone who wanted an excuse to move past them exactly the excuse they needed. Now they're sitting at home while she breaks down the NBA's best players on national television. The owners aren't reversing course, the networks aren't changing their minds, the sponsors aren't coming back with better offers. The business has moved on, and it moved on in the direction that the numbers always indicated it would, toward the one player who made everyone's investment worth more just by showing up. The WNBA doesn't belong to its veterans anymore. It belongs to the girl from Iowa they couldn't break. And the most remarkable thing about all of it, the detail that makes this the most fascinating karma arc in recent sports history, is that she never had to do a single thing to make it happen. She just had to survive. They did the rest. And she's just getting started.